The night of the 5th of June, 1944, was cloudy over the English Channel, the kind of overcast that made navigation uncertain and anti-aircraft gunners nervous in different ways. Somewhere above that cloud layer, more than 800 C-47 transport aircraft flew in long, droning columns toward the French coast, each one carrying roughly 16 to 17 paratroopers sitting knee to knee on canvas seats in the dark. Their combined kit, rifle, reserve chute, ammunition, rations, and medical supplies, pressing down on each man's body at around 90 to 100 pounds of dead weight. The aircraft were flying low enough that the men inside could feel the coastal flak not just as sound, but as vibration through the aluminium floor beneath them. In a few minutes, the green jump light would come on. In those last seconds before it did, men looked straight ahead at nothing in particular and thought their own thoughts in the dark. 13,000 American paratroopers dropped into Normandy that night, and in the earliest hours of June the 6th, the largest airborne operation in history to that point, split between two divisions. The 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, dropped across the base of the Carentan Peninsula with orders to seize 4 causeways leading inland from Utah Beach and destroy bridges over the Douve River before German reinforcements could use them. The 82nd Airborne dropped further north and west, tasked with securing the town of Sainte-Mère-Eglise and blocking German movement from the interior toward the beaches. Both drops were badly scattered. Cloud cover, anti-aircraft fire, and pilot evasion threw men miles from their designated drop zones. Some landed in flooded fields that the Germans had deliberately inundated to depths of 4 to 5 feet, and men who hit the water, weighed down by 100 pounds of equipment, drowned before they could free themselves. Others landed alone in orchards or hedgerows, with no way of knowing where they were or whether anyone else from their unit was within a mile of them. What I keep returning to when I study the first hours of D-Day, and I spent time at the National World War II Museum working through the oral testimonies collected from 101st veterans, which are held in their digital archive and are unlike anything you'll read in a campaign history, is how much of what actually worked that morning was improvised by men who had been dropped in the wrong field, found 1 or 2 others they didn't know, and still went looking for something useful to do. The formal objectives were often out of reach. The informal objective, create confusion, keep German reserves from moving, buy time, was achieved partly through chaos that happened to cut in the right direction. The 82nd Airborne's experience around Sainte-Mère-Eglise crystallized the whole operation's character. The town was already awake before the paratroopers arrived. A house fire had drawn French villagers and German soldiers into the square, and when C-47s flew over and troopers began jumping, they dropped directly into that lit square, under fire, with nowhere to maneuver. Men were shot in their harnesses before they hit the ground. Private John Steele's parachute caught on the church steeple, and he hung there, playing dead, for 2 hours while the battle moved around him below. And yet, the 82nd still secured Sainte-Mère-Eglise by morning, the first French town liberated on D-Day, because enough men from enough different aircraft found each other in the hedgerows and kept pushing toward the objective. By the time the beach landings began, at approximately 6:30 in the morning, the airborne operation had already bled for several hours. The 82nd Airborne Division suffered 156 killed, 347 wounded, and 756 missing on D-Day alone. The 101st counted 182 killed, 557 wounded, and 501 missing. Together across the Normandy campaign, the 2 divisions sustained roughly 10,000 casualties. German forces in the area spent the critical first hours of June the 6th unable to sort out where the real threat was coming from. Isolated paratroopers collided with German patrols across a 50-mile swath of countryside, creating the impression of a much larger, more coordinated assault than actually existed. That confusion bought exactly the time the beach landings needed. If sleep is finding you now, let the image of those 800 aircraft droning through the cloud above the channel carry you somewhere quiet. The green light coming on, men standing up in the dark, the blast of cold air at the open door. Everything that happened on those beaches 6 hours later had those 13,000 men jumping into the night somewhere underneath it. The whole story, the training, the drop, the chaos, the causeways, Sainte-Mère Eglise, and what those men made possible before dawn, is what this documentary traces from the first engine turning over on an English runway to the last position secured on a Normandy road. This is the entire history of the D-Day airborne assault. 13,000 paratroopers behind enemy lines. Chapter 1. The weight of what they carried. A number that keeps appearing across almost every logistics document from the Normandy airborne planning phase. And it isn't the one historians tend to lead with. It isn't 13,000. It isn't the 6th of June. It's 6,000 pounds. That was the maximum payload of a Douglas C-47 Skytrain, the aircraft that carried the entire American airborne assault into the dark above Normandy. 6,000 pounds of cargo, or, as the Air Force Museum's fact sheet puts it, between 18 and 22 fully equipped paratroopers. Not 28, not 30. 18 to 22. And that distinction matters more than most people realize, because everything that followed, the scatter, the confusion, the men who landed miles from where they were supposed to be, begins right there, in a weight calculation, before anyone left the ground. Each man who boarded those planes on the night of the 5th of June 1944 was carrying somewhere between 70 and 90 pounds of equipment. That included his parachute, his reserve chute, his weapon, his ammunition, his rations, his gas mask, his entrenching tool, and whatever specialist gear his unit had assigned him. A radio, a bazooka round, a demolition kit. Now think about what that means arithmetically. An average paratrooper might have weighed around 160 pounds himself. Add 90 pounds of kit. You have a man of 250 pounds trying to shuffle down the narrow aisle of a transport aircraft, hook his static line, and stand in a door at altitude before doing the most physically demanding thing imaginable, which is absorbing the shock of a parachute opening and then a ground impact, while simultaneously trying to maintain tactical awareness of where he is. I've spent time with the wait lists in the after-action documentation, and they're genuinely staggering. Not in a dramatic sense, in a purely mechanical human body sense. The C-47 itself is worth a moment of explanation, because it was never designed to be a warplane. It was a development of the Douglas DC-3 commercial airliner, and when the Army Air Forces took it on, they were essentially requisitioning a passenger aircraft and asking it to operate at the edge of its design parameters. 2 Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines, a wingspan of 95 feet, a maximum gross weight at takeoff of around 26,000 pounds. It was a reliable machine, by the standards of 1944 cargo aviation, remarkably so. But reliability at standard commercial operation and reliability in a massed night formation over occupied Europe, with anti-aircraft fire and cloud cover, and no GPS, and pilots who had limited experience of the specific terrain they were crossing, are two entirely different things. The aircraft performed as designed. The problem was that the mission had moved well beyond what it was designed for. On the evening of the 5th of June, more than 800 C-47s lifted off from airfields scattered across the English Midlands and South. They flew in formations of 9 aircraft, V of Vs, which looked orderly on the briefing map, and were considerably less orderly in the dark over the English Channel. The 9th Troop Carrier Command had trained its crews, but the combination of factors they encountered over Normandy would have taxed far more experienced aviators. Cloud banks forced formation breaks. Anti-aircraft fire from German positions on the Carentan Peninsula caused pilots to take evasive action, which altered their airspeed and their heading. Some aircraft climbed to avoid flak. Some descended. By the time they crossed the coast and approached the drop zones, many of the formations had broken apart entirely. Pilots who couldn't see the ground, couldn't see each other, and couldn't reliably determine their position were making split-second decisions about when to give the green light. Some made good decisions. Many didn't. The result was a scatter that became one of the defining facts of the entire operation. 13,400 American paratroopers boarded those aircraft. What happened to them in the air, in the sequence of events between takeoff in England and the moment their feet hit Norman soil, determined almost everything that followed on the ground. And the ground itself was part of the problem. The Germans had been flooding the low-lying fields inland from Utah Beach since the previous year, blocking drainage sluices along the Murderay and Douve rivers to create an anti-invasion barrier. From the air, in darkness, a flooded field and a dry one were indistinguishable. Men landed in water they didn't expect. Some drowned. The exact number is not reliably captured in any single document I've encountered, because the categories used for casualty accounting, killed, wounded, missing, didn't separately record cause of death. That gap in the record is itself informative. The 9th Troop Carrier Command figures, documented at the ddayoverlord.com research archive, which compiles primary operational data, show the scale of the airlift. More than 800 aircraft carrying American paratroopers alone, with additional sorties for British airborne forces to the east. The coordination required was extraordinary, and the planning was genuinely sophisticated. Pathfinder teams were supposed to jump an hour ahead of the main body and mark the drop zones with Eureka radar beacons and amber lights. Pilots were supposed to acquire those signals on their Rebecca receivers and adjust their final approach accordingly. The system had worked, partially, in earlier operations in Sicily and Italy. It worked partially in Normandy. Partially. That word carries a great deal of weight when you're talking about 13,000 people jumping out of aircraft. The planning documents drawn up in the weeks before the 6th of June show a mission designed around a set of assumptions about navigational accuracy that the available technology couldn't fully deliver. Brigades were supposed to land in organized packets on marked zones, assemble within hours, and execute coordinated assaults on specific objectives. The assumptions weren't irrational. They were based on available technology and available training time. But the gap between the planned drop pattern and the actual one was wide enough to reshape the entire battle. What the after-action reports ultimately describe isn't the operation that was planned. It's a different operation entirely, fought by the same men, with the same objectives, but in conditions that the plan had not modeled. That's where this story begins. Not on the beaches, in the arithmetic of weight and payload and wind and darkness, in the hours before anyone fired a weapon. The machines that carried 13,000 men across the channel were built for commerce and repurposed for the largest airborne assault yet attempted. They did what they could. So did the men inside them. What neither could fully account for was the friction, the technical, atmospheric, logistical friction that turns a plan on paper into a three-dimensional emergency in the dark. Understanding that friction is the only honest way to understand what the men on the ground actually accomplished. Chapter 2. The General Who Said No. There's a letter in the historical record that almost stopped the entire airborne operation before it began. It didn't come from a politician or a civilian. It came from a senior Allied air commander, and it was addressed to the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commanding Allied air forces for Operation Overlord, wrote to General Dwight Eisenhower shortly before the invasion and told him, in formal military language, that the planned airborne assault would result in the destruction of 2 fine divisions. His casualty estimate, documented across multiple historical accounts, including the Havoc Journal's detailed military analysis, published in May 2025, ran as high as 70%, with some sources distinguishing between 50% losses among paratroopers and 70% among glider troops specifically. He called it a futile slaughter. He recommended cancellation. Eisenhower didn't cancel it. That decision, taken by one man in the early days of June 1944, under the pressure of a plan years in the making, and weather conditions that had already forced a one-day postponement, is one of the most consequential individual choices of the entire war. What's interesting to me when I look at this episode isn't that Eisenhower overruled his air commander. Senior commanders overrule subordinates all the time. What's interesting is the nature of Lee Mallory's objection, because it wasn't tactical timidity, it was an engineering argument. He'd looked at the same anti-aircraft positions, the same cloud cover forecasts, the same drop zone geometry, and reached a different conclusion about what was survivable. He was applying the same information to the same problem and arriving at a fundamentally different answer. That's not a personality clash. That's a genuine disagreement about risk calculation. The precedent Lee Mallory was drawing on was Sicily. In July 1943, during the Allied invasion of that island, a catastrophic series of coordination failures had resulted in Allied anti-aircraft gunners shooting down American transport aircraft carrying their own paratroopers. 23 C-47s were destroyed. Hundreds of American airborne troops were killed or wounded by friendly fire. The Sicily debacle had permanently marked the minds of everyone involved in Allied airborne planning, and Lee Mallory was among those who drew the sharpest conclusions from it. If coordination failures could produce those results in Sicily, a relatively straightforward operation compared to what was planned for Normandy, what might happen when you combined navigational uncertainty, German anti-aircraft, cloud cover, and a drop zone geometry that placed the American paratroopers deeper into the Carentan Peninsula than any previous operation? Eisenhower's counter-argument, as reconstructed from his memoirs and from the accounts of those around him, rested on strategic necessity. The Utah beach landing was the western anchor of the entire Overlord front. It depended on the quick movement of troops inland through causeways that crossed flooded ground. If those causeways were not secured from the western side before the seaborne troops hit the beach, the men coming ashore would be channeled through bottlenecks that well-positioned German defenders could devastate. Without the airborne securing those exits, Utah might fail. And if Utah failed, the entire western flank of the invasion was exposed. The calculus was brutal, but not irrational. Accept predicted casualties in the airborne operation, or risk far larger casualties and potentially strategic failure on the beach. Eisenhower chose to accept the airborne risk. He wrote a note that evening, the 5th of June, that he kept in his pocket. It was the note he would release if the operation failed. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, it began. The note is in the National Archives. It was the admission of failure he was prepared to make. And then he went to the airfields to watch the paratroopers board their aircraft. The image of Eisenhower moving through those crowds of men, talking to them, watching them climb into the C-47s, is one of the most documented moments of the entire war. He knew Lee Mallory's prediction. He knew it might be right. He sent them anyway. That's not heroism in any simple sense. It's the loneliness of command decision. What actually happened? The documented casualties for the 2 American airborne divisions on D-Day, the 6th of June alone, were 2,499, drawn from Gordon Harrison's authoritative cross-channel attack, published by the Department of the Army in 1951. That figure combines killed, wounded, and missing. Against a force of 13,400, it represents roughly 19%, not 70%. In the weeks that followed, as the Normandy campaign continued, the total casualty figures for both divisions through the end of June climbed considerably higher. The 82nd Airborne would sustain 4,480 casualties through the 30th of June. The 101st, 4,670. But on D-Day itself, Lee Mallory's worst-case projection did not materialize. He later acknowledged this in writing, recording that the actual losses were far less than he had feared. There's a source conflict worth noting here. Eisenhower, in his post-war memoirs, is quoted as saying airborne casualties were approximately 8%. The Modern War Institute at West Point flags this figure. 8% of 13,000 is roughly 1,040. The documented D-Day figure is 2,499, nearly 2.5 times that. The discrepancy might reflect a different denominator, a different time window, or a different category of loss. Perhaps Eisenhower was recalling killed in action only. Or perhaps memory, even the memory of supreme commanders, smooths and compresses. I don't want to be uncharitable about it, but the numbers don't reconcile cleanly, and that matters, because the narrative of the airborne operation as a near-total success depends partly on which numbers you choose to emphasize. Lee Mallory's letter is uncomfortable to read in retrospect, because it was substantially wrong in its prediction, but right in its underlying concern. The airborne operation was riskier than its planners wanted to admit. The scatter, the navigational failures, the casualty rates among specific units, all of that vindicates at least the spirit of his warning, even if the specific 70% figure proved too pessimistic. Eisenhower made the right call in the sense that the operation succeeded. Whether it was the right call, given what was knowable at the time, is a harder question. And it's the harder questions, not the triumphant ones, that tend to tell you how military decisions actually get made. Chapter 3. The First Man Down. Just after midnight on the 6th of June, 1944, a C-47 carrying 18 men crossed the Norman coastline at low altitude and began its approach. The man standing in the door was Captain Frank Lillyman, 28 years old, commander of the Pathfinder detachment of the 101st Airborne Division. He'd injured his leg in training, torn ligament documented in post-war accounts of his service, and he was about to become the first Allied soldier to land on French soil in the invasion. Not the most famous man on D-Day, not the most senior, the first. There's a difference, and it carries its own particular kind of weight. The Pathfinder concept was born directly from the Sicily disaster. If the root problem in 1943 was that transport pilots couldn't find their drop zones, the solution was to send a small team ahead, on the ground first, with equipment that could actively guide the incoming aircraft to the correct position. The Eureka radar beacon, a portable transmitter that responded to signals from the Rebecca receiver mounted in the lead aircraft, was the technical core of this idea. A Pathfinder team would jump 60 minutes before the main body, set up Eureka beacons on the designated drop zone, and lay out T-shaped patterns of amber lights on the ground. The aircraft would pick up the beacon signal, triangulate their position, and release their sticks over the right field. In theory, clean and logical. In practice, dependent on a chain of conditions that the 6th of June did not reliably provide. Lillyman's team landed slightly off target, near Saint-Germain-de-Varreville, a matter of perhaps a mile or so from the planned drop zone A, based on the soldiers from the sky account of the operation. 1 mile in a dark Norman field, with hedgerows breaking line of sight and no landmarks visible in the pre-dawn darkness, is not trivial. They had a job to do, and roughly an hour to do it. The Eureka sets were heavy, around 14 pounds each, and they needed to be positioned and activated before the main lift arrived. The amber lights needed to be laid out in the correct pattern, and all of this had to happen while moving through unfamiliar terrain, in darkness, potentially under observation by German forces. Lilliman's team got to work. They weren't the only Pathfinder team that night. Both American airborne divisions had sent similar groups ahead, but his team's relative success in marking Drop Zone A contributed to the more accurate drop received by one of the regiments that followed him in. I find the Pathfinder mission fascinating for a specific reason that isn't always discussed in the standard accounts. The men who volunteered for Pathfinder duty knew they would be on the ground, alone and unsupported, for at least an hour before any friendly force arrived in numbers. 60 minutes, in occupied France, with a torch and a radar set, and 6 men tasked with security. They couldn't dig in, because the noise would compromise their position. They couldn't call for help, because the radio silence protocols of the operation limited what they could transmit. They had to remain where the beacon needed to be, which might be precisely where a German patrol was most likely to pass. It was the most exposed position in the entire operation, and it was assigned to men who had specifically chosen it. The Eureka-Rebecca system's technical limitations are documented in the post-war USAF historical studies. The system worked on a radar interrogation principle. The Rebecca in the aircraft sent out a pulse. The Eureka on the ground responded, and the Rebecca receiver displayed a bearing and approximate range. Maximum effective range under good conditions was roughly 10 miles. But several factors degraded this in practice. The same cloud layers that disrupted visual navigation also attenuated the radar signal. Aircraft that broke formation during evasive maneuvers might not be in the correct position to acquire the beacon even when it was transmitting cleanly. And the angle of approach mattered. A pilot who overflew the beacon at an angle, rather than flying directly toward it, would get a bearing that was harder to interpret accurately on the primitive cockpit display of a 1944 transport aircraft. The system was significantly better than nothing. It was not the precise electronic guidance that planners, under pressure to produce a workable scheme, may have oversold to those above them in the chain of command. The HistoryNet account of Lilliman's mission, published in June 2019, and drawing on post-war interviews and records, describes the amber lights as being laid out in a T-shape to indicate the drop zone axis and wind direction. 7 lights in total. That's a small signal, 7 amber lights in a large field, visible to pilots at altitude through whatever cloud persisted. For the lead pilot of the incoming serial, the moment of acquiring those lights through the windscreen of his C-47 was the difference between a correctly placed drop and another contribution to the scatter. Some pilots saw them, some didn't. Some weren't close enough to see them, even if they'd been looking in exactly the right direction. The result across the 2 American divisions was mixed. Where Pathfinder teams landed close to their assigned zones and established their beacons before the main lift arrived, drops were more concentrated. Where teams had landed off target, or lost equipment, or were engaged by German patrols before they could set up, the incoming aircraft had to fall back on dead reckoning and visual identification of landmarks that, in the dark and cloud, were often impossible to distinguish. The Rock Island auction blog on the 101st's Pathfinders notes that Lilliman's men placed Eureka transmitters in specific positions on the zone, with a security element of approximately 6 men holding the perimeter while the beacon operators worked. 18 men total. The difference between success and failure across entire regiments came down, in some cases, to whether 18 men with radar sets were in roughly the right field at the right time. Lilliman survived the operation. He survived the subsequent Market Garden drop in September 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, and Operation Varsity over the Rhine in March 1945. He'd been wounded by shrapnel during a follow-up glider operation in Normandy, days after the initial jump. He went on. Most of the documentation about him focuses on the fact that he was first Allied soldier on French soil. What tends to get less attention is what first actually meant that night. It meant being alone, in the dark, with a 14-pound radar set an injured leg, and a window of roughly 60 minutes to shape the trajectory of an operation involving 13,000 people who were coming whether the beacons worked or not. Chapter 4. The plan that didn't survive contact with intelligence. Military planners have a saying. A version of it is attributed to various generals across various wars, that no plan survives contact with the enemy. What's less often discussed is that some plans don't even survive contact with their own intelligence updates. The original operational design for the 82nd Airborne Division's drop into Normandy called for the division to land west of Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte, a town roughly in the middle of the Carentan Peninsula. That plan was built around a certain understanding of where the Germans were and weren't. Then, in late May 1944, the intelligence picture changed. The 82nd Airborne Division's Facebook page, which posts extensively from primary divisional records and is run with historical rigor, documented this episode in May 2024. The division's mission was changed on May 26th. The 82nd would now seize and control key routes and bridges along the Meurthe and Douve rivers. The reason for that change, documented across multiple sources, including the Army University Press staff ride materials, was the detection of the German 91st Infantry Division, which had been positioned in exactly the area where the original drop was planned. The 91st Air Landing Division, equipped with motor transport and artillery, positioned as a mobile reserve, had moved into place after the original 82nd plan had been drawn up. Dropping 13,000 men into their positions would have been not a tactical surprise, but a tactical catastrophe. The intelligence that forced the plan change came partly through signals intercepts, Ultra, the Allied cryptanalysis program that had been reading German Enigma encrypted communications throughout the war. The NSA's own historical documentation on Ultra's role in D-Day notes that signals intelligence gave Allied planners detailed information on German order of battle, unit positions, and capabilities. In the case of the 91st Division's presence on the Carentan, the detection of a division-sized force in the planned drop zone was exactly the kind of tactical intelligence that Ultra was generating by the summer of 1944. The division couldn't be where the plan said it would land. A new plan was required, at short notice, for an operation that was already days away. The revised mission placed the 82nd's 3 parachute infantry regiments on a different axis, astride the Meurthe River rather than further west. One regiment was assigned drop zones east of the river, near the road junction at Sainte-Mère-Eglise. The other 2 were assigned zones west of the river, with objectives including bridge seizure across the Meurthe and Douve systems. This was a more compressed operational geometry than the original plan, with less space between the 2 American airborne divisions, and more reliance on precise drop placement to keep units separated and properly oriented. The Meurthe itself, now the center of the revised plan, was flooded. That detail was known. The full tactical implications of a flooded valley for men dropping by parachute in the dark were perhaps less fully modeled. Here is the thing that strikes me most about the May 26th plan change. It happened 10 days before the operation. 10 days to rewrite drop zone assignments, revise Pathfinder team targets, update every briefing document, re-coordinate with the 9th Troop Carrier Command on flight routing, and ensure that every man from private to colonel understood his new objective. That's not impossible. Military headquarters are built for exactly this kind of rapid revision. But it is a significant compression. The men who had been studying their original objectives, rehearsing their approach routes, and building mental maps of their assigned terrain, now had 10 days to internalize an entirely different set of coordinates. Some managed this better than others. The degree to which individual units had absorbed the new plan, as opposed to defaulting to muscle memory of the old one, is not something the after-action reports can fully reveal. You can't document what a man was thinking as he landed in a dark field. The 91st Division itself, whose presence had triggered all of this replanning, would become one of the central antagonists of the airborne battle. Its commander, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falle, would be killed in the early hours of the 6th of June by American paratroopers from the 508th Regiment. Not because of any planned targeted operation, but because his car happened to approach a building that paratroopers had already occupied. His death removed the man most capable of directing a coordinated response to the airborne landings. That coincidence, the enemy division commander killed by chance, by men who didn't know who he was, is one of those hinges of military history that no amount of planning can account for. It happened. The plan didn't foresee it. The outcome was shaped by it anyway. The logistics of the revision cascade through every aspect of the operation. Pathfinder teams had to be retargeted. Aircraft flight paths had to be recalculated to account for the new drop zone positions relative to the naval exclusion corridors. You couldn't fly the transport formations directly over the invasion fleet without the risk of triggering friendly anti-aircraft fire, which meant the routing added navigational complexity that further stressed the pilot's ability to maintain accurate positioning over the drop zones. The Army University Press Normandy staff ride materials document the finalized routing, which brought the aircraft around the western edge of the Carentan, rather than directly across the channel. This routing added distance and time to the approach, and exposed the formations to German anti-aircraft fire from positions they might otherwise have avoided. Every change in a complex operation produces secondary effects. The May 26th revision produced several. The operation that flew on the night of the 5th of June was therefore neither the original plan nor a clean execution of the revision. It was a plan that had been significantly altered under time pressure, flown by crews who had limited experience of the specific conditions they encountered, carrying men who had 10 days to learn a new set of objectives after months of rehearsing a different one. I'm not saying this to diminish what those men accomplished. I'm saying it because the standard narrative, brave men jumping into darkness, taking their objectives, opening the way for Utah Beach, is accurate but incomplete. The chaos that followed wasn't a failure of courage. It was, in large part, a consequence of the specific operational conditions that had been created by the intelligence-driven plan change, the technical limitations of the navigation system, and the weather and anti-aircraft environment over the Carentan Peninsula. Understanding that sequence is the only way to understand what 30% under command by nightfall actually means. Chapter 5. Sainte-Mère-Église. The town the plan got right. By 4:30 in the morning on the 6th of June 1944, the stars and stripes were flying over the church square of Sainte-Mère-Église. The D-Day Revisited historical archive records it precisely. At approximately 4:30, the town became the first in France to be liberated. That flag went up while the rest of the airborne operation was still in various states of scattered chaos across the Carentan Peninsula. While men were still landing in flooded fields, while the 507th had its sticks distributed across 20 kilometers of Norman countryside, the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had taken a town and raised a flag and done, roughly, what the plan said it would do. The contrast is stark, and it deserves attention because military history tends to treat chaos and order as opposites, when in fact they often coexist inside the same operation on the same night. What made the 505th's drop at Sainte-Mère-Église different from the catastrophic scatters further west wasn't luck alone. The D-Day Overlord Research Archive notes that 118 sticks from the 505th were released under what it describes as relatively favourable conditions. The drop zone east of the Murderay, closer to the coast, was in a part of the Carentan where cloud cover was somewhat less dense and where the Pathfinder beacons for at least some serials were acquired. The result was a concentration of paratroopers that was unusual by the standards of the night. The town itself had a peculiarity that no one had planned for. A fire had broken out in a building near the town square before the drop. The documentary record doesn't resolve the exact cause, and German soldiers and French civilians had gathered in the square to fight it. The illumination from the fire lit the square from below just as paratroopers began descending into it. The worldwarmonuments.org account describes how members of the 505th found themselves descending through a sky lit by fire from a burning building into a square occupied by German troops who were looking up. Some paratroopers were shot while still in the air. Some landed in trees. John Steele, whose parachute caught on the church steeple, feigned death for approximately 2 hours and was eventually taken prisoner before later escaping. His story became famous enough to be commemorated on the church itself, where a mannequin in paratrooper kit still hangs from the steeple. What happened to those individual men in the square is not the operational story of Sainte-Mère-Église. The operational story is what happened in the hours that followed, when enough of the 505th was assembled under recognizable command to actually function as a military unit. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss led elements of his battalion into the town, cleared the German garrison, which was a relatively small defending force rather than a prepared defensive line, and secured the critical road junction that the town represented. Sainte-Mère-Église sat on the main road running north to south through the Carentan Peninsula, the road that would need to be controlled if the Germans were to push reinforcements south to counter Utah Beach. Holding it mattered not just symbolically, but practically, as a blocking position. The after-action report compiled by Major General Ridgway's headquarters at the Eisenhower Library records the flag raising and the town's capture in its D-Day timeline entries. It also records what happened next, because the Germans didn't simply accept the loss of the town. Throughout the morning and afternoon of the 6th, German forces made repeated efforts to retake Sainte-Mère-Église. The 505th held. Later that day, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin van der Voort, commanding 2nd Battalion, sent Lieutenant Turner Turnbull with approximately 40 men to hold a roadblock at Neuville-au-Plain, a village a short distance north of Sainte-Mère-Église, to prevent German armour from pushing down the road into the town's rear. Turnbull's force held that position for approximately 6 hours before being overwhelmed, buying time that allowed the rest of the division to consolidate. The National World War II Museum's Airborne Invasion article documents this action specifically. 40 men, 6 hours. It's the kind of detail that the summary figures of killed, wounded, and missing don't contain. There's something in the success at Sainte-Mère-Église that I think the standard telling misses. The town's capture is often presented as proof that the airborne plan worked. But a more precise reading suggests it's proof that one regiment's drop worked tolerably well, in a specific sector, under specific conditions, because that sector happened to have slightly better navigation conditions than others, and because the defenders in the town were surprised and thinly spread. The operation didn't succeed uniformly. It succeeded in patches, and Sainte-Mère-Église was the most visible patch, the one the cameras eventually found, the one the film industry turned into a symbol. The men who took it were not more courageous than the men scattered across the Mercenary marshes to the west. They were better placed. That's not a small distinction. The illuminated square, the burning building, the men descending into firelight. That image has become the visual shorthand for D-Day's airborne assault. It obscures as much as it reveals. It obscures the fact that most of the men who jumped that night didn't land in a lit square with a visible landmark. They landed in dark fields, in water, in trees, with no idea where they were and no way to contact their commanders. The ones who took Sainte-Mère-Église were the exception. Understanding the exception requires understanding the rule, the scattered, improvised, costly reality of the rest of the operation. And that's what the next several hours of this story will give us. Chapter 6. The Machines That Fell. Gliders at Dawn. At 4 minutes past 4 in the morning on the 6th of June, the first of 52 Waco C G4A gliders touched down in Normandy. Or rather, crashed down would be a more accurate description, because that's what a glider landing at 40 to 60 miles per hour into an unlit Norman field, in the dark, without engine power, and without the ability to go around for a second approach, actually is. It's a controlled crash, managed by a pilot who has no ability to adjust his descent profile once he's committed to his approach path. The question isn't whether it's going to be rough. The question is whether rough will be survivable. The Waco C G4A was, on paper, an impressive piece of engineering for its era. It was built of fabric-covered wood and metal, 48 feet and 8 inches long, with a wingspan of 83 feet and 8 inches. Empty weight, 3,900 pounds. Maximum payload, 3,600 pounds, nearly its own weight again. It could carry 13 troops and their equipment, or a jeep, or a quarter-ton truck, or a 75mm howitzer, loaded through an upward hinged nose section that swung forward for access. That hinged nose was the key to the glider's utility. Without it, you couldn't load wheeled or tracked equipment. With it, you could deliver the kind of heavy weapons that a paratrooper couldn't carry in a static line drop. Anti-tank guns, artillery pieces, vehicles, things that fundamentally changed what a lightly equipped airborne force could do after landing. The problem with the hinged nose in practice is that it made the aircraft's forward structure the point of first contact in a hard landing. Norman fields had hedgerows. Hedgerows in 1944 were not the decorative garden boundaries of English imagination. They were earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, some of them several feet high, built up over centuries as field boundaries, utterly invisible from the air at night. A glider approaching at 60 miles per hour that struck a hedgerow didn't simply stop. It decelerated from 60 miles per hour to 0 in a distance measured in feet. What happened to the occupants and to the hinged nose section in that deceleration is documented in the medical after-action reports. The 326th Airborne Medical Company report, written by Captain Willis McKee and preserved in the National Archives at Record Group 112, describes the injuries from the initial glider phase. Fractures, sprains, crush injuries consistent with rapid deceleration. The report doesn't describe dramatic events. It describes systematic trauma across multiple patients, the cumulative physical consequence of what the planning documents called assault landings. The 82nd Airborne's first glider wave, 52 CG-4As carrying artillery, anti-tank guns, engineers and command elements, arrived at approximately 400 hours. The after-action report records that by 5:30 in the evening of D-Day, only 6 of 16 planned 57mm anti-tank guns had been recovered and were in position. 6 out of 16, 37%. The remainder were either inaccessible in wrecked gliders, lost in flooded terrain, or simply not yet located by the engineering teams tasked with unloading them. The 80mm anti-aircraft battalion record shows 6 57mm guns in position by 1750 hours, a detail that appears in the division's after-action timeline. For a unit whose mission included stopping German armour from crossing the Murderay, the gap between 16 operational anti-tank guns and 6 was the difference between a credible anti-armour defence and an improvised one. I want to be careful here about the difference between what the records show and what they imply. The after-action report is an administrative document written under time pressure in the field, and it captures what was reported through the chain of command, which isn't necessarily the complete picture of what was happening at the ground level. Some guns that were listed as unrecoverable on D-Day were brought into action the following day. Some that were listed as lost were found later in different sectors. The figure of 6 out of 16 is the snapshot from a specific hour on a specific day, and it should be read as such rather than as a permanent indictment of the glider program. But snapshots matter when you're fighting, and the snapshot at 5:30 on D-Day evening, when German armour was probing the Mercenary crossings, was 6 guns. The glider program's fundamental paradox, one I keep returning to in the planning documents, is that it was designed to solve the weight problem of airborne operations, while introducing a survivability problem that couldn't be fully engineered away. You needed heavy weapons. Paratroopers couldn't carry heavy weapons in a static line drop. Gliders could carry heavy weapons. But gliders carrying heavy weapons into unlit, obstacle-strewn terrain at night, at approach speeds that left no margin for error, produced casualties and equipment losses that partially offset the advantage the heavy weapons were supposed to provide. The Airborne Museum's documentation of the 82nd Airborne's glider element on D-Day records approximately 7.5% casualties on landing, not in combat, but from the landing itself. That's before anyone had fired a weapon in their direction. Waco's engineers in Wichita, Kansas, had designed as capable an aircraft as their constraints allowed. The pilots who flew those gliders into Normandy were executing a genuinely difficult piece of aviation under genuinely terrible conditions. The men in the back, artillery crews, engineers, headquarters staff, had no control over any of it. They sat in fabric and metal frames, in darkness, knowing they were descending into a field they couldn't see, and they waited for it to stop. The machines that fell in the early hours of the 6th of June were not a failure of technology or courage. They were the physical expression of an operational requirement that had no clean solution in 1944. Heavy weapons in an airborne operation meant gliders. Gliders meant crash landings. Crash landings at night in hedgerow terrain meant casualties before the battle had properly begun. That sequence was understood by the planners. It was accepted. The men in the back accepted it too, in the way that soldiers accept the hazards of their specific role. Not because they didn't know the risks, but because the alternative was to not be there at all. Chapter 7. The weight they left behind. There's a practice that happened at every airfield in England on the evening of the 5th of June, 1944, that almost never appears in the operational histories of the D-Day airborne assault. Before the men boarded the aircraft, many of them sat down and wrote letters. Not orders, not briefing notes. Letters to wives, parents, brothers, and in some cases children, who were too young to understand what was happening. The letters were handed to chaplains or to unit administrators, to be posted if the man didn't come back. Father Francis Sampson, the Catholic chaplain of one of the 101st Airborne Division's regiments, had jumped with his men in training and was prepared to do so again over Normandy. He would become the first chaplain to invade France on D-Day. Men like Sampson were the custodians of those letters. They held other people's words through the hours that followed. I mention this not to sentimentalize the record, but because those letters are part of what the weight figures in the after-action documents don't capture. Each man who boarded a C-47 on the night of the 5th of June was carrying between 70 and 90 pounds of military equipment. That's the documented figure, consistent across the planning records and the post-war technical analyses of American airborne loadouts. Parachute, reserve, weapon, ammunition, rations, gas mask, entrenching tool, specialist kit. The total mass sat on a human body that might itself weigh 160 pounds, producing a combined weight that physically altered how a man walked, how he sat, how he stood in the door of an aircraft at 500 feet. The letters he'd just handed to a chaplain weighed nothing. The rest weighed everything.
The logistical mathematics of what each man carried is one of those areas where the archive produces specific numbers that repay attention. A T-5 parachute assembly, the main parachute used by American paratroopers for the Normandy operation, weighed approximately 45 pounds in its packed configuration, including the harness. The reserve chute added around 20 pounds. That's 65 pounds of life support hardware before a single round of ammunition was considered. The M1 Garand rifle that most infantrymen carried weighed about 9.5 pounds unloaded. A basic load of ammunition, 8-round clips, standard infantry allocation, added several more. Then the rations, the entrenching tool, the personal first aid kit, the gas mask that everyone hated and almost nobody believed they'd need. When the planning documents and post-war technical accounts say 70 to 90 pounds, they mean it quite precisely. Some men, with specialist equipment added, demolition kits, radio components, bazooka ammunition, were carrying more. What that weight meant physically for a static line jump is something that requires a moment of technical explanation, because it's germane to understanding what happened when things went wrong. A fully laden paratrooper moving toward the door of a C-47 wasn't walking, he was shuffling, because the equipment riding against his legs restricted his stride. He had to duck slightly to clear the aircraft's doorframe. When he went out, the deceleration of the parachute opening, happening in roughly 2 to 3 seconds, was absorbed by a harness designed for the purpose, but still producing a sudden, significant jolt through the body. At 500 feet altitude, there were approximately 30 seconds between exit and landing. In those 30 seconds, the man was falling at a rate that produced a ground impact equivalent, in energy terms, to stepping off a 12-foot wall with 70 to 90 pounds of equipment, in the dark, onto terrain he couldn't see until the last few seconds. Men who landed in flooded fields with that load were in a specific kind of danger that the planning documents acknowledged but couldn't quantify in advance. The Murderay lowlands, deliberately inundated by the Germans, produced water depths that varied considerably across the flooded area. A man who landed in knee-deep water, unhitched his harness quickly, and moved to firm ground, survived with nothing worse than wet equipment. A man who landed in chest-deep water, face down, couldn't unhitch fast enough. The missing category in the casualty returns contains an unknown number of these cases, because there was no mechanism, in the chaos of the first hours, to distinguish a man missing because he'd drowned from a man missing because he'd landed 2 kilometers from his assembly point and was still trying to find it. Both were missing. The letters they'd left with the chaplains might or might not eventually find a recipient. The National World War II Museum's letter archive, described in a June 2024 YouTube presentation by senior curator Kim Guise, contains material from both before and after the Normandy invasion. Letters written in England in the days before the jump show men in a specific psychological state, aware of what was coming, trying to say something adequate, operating under security restrictions that meant they couldn't tell their families where they were going or when. The letters that came back after, from men who survived, sometimes described the jump itself in terms that the operational records don't reproduce. One soldier, writing to his family 16 days after the invasion, described the moment his parachute opened and he stopped what he called being a package. That framing, a package, is the soldier's eye view of what the airlift's payload arithmetic produced at the human level. He was one item in a cargo manifest. Then the chute opened, and he became something else. The equipment that didn't make it to the ground intact was also part of the story. The after-action reports track weapons and specialist gear that were lost in the scatter, pack howitzers with their crews, anti-tank guns still in wrecked gliders, demolition charges in bundles that landed in flooded fields or enemy-held territory. What the reports don't track is the personal equipment,
The letters a man was carrying that he never got to read again. The photographs. The small objects that civilians and soldiers alike attached significance to, which in the chaos of landing and reassembly were abandoned in fields and hedgerows across the Carentan Peninsula. The after-action system wasn't designed to inventory those losses. They show up, decades later, in the collections of Norman farmers and local museums, identified by unit patches and stenciled names. The material residue of 13,000 men passing through French countryside in the dark. The chaplains who landed alongside their regiments, some by parachute, some in gliders, carried their own specific burden. Father Ignatius Matanowski, the Franciscan chaplain who jumped with one of the 101st regiments on D-Day, was the only American military chaplain killed in action on the 6th of June. He died from the wounds he received while performing his duties in the first hours after landing. The military.com account of his death, published in June 2024, describes him as having jumped with his men, landing in the Carentan, and being mortally wounded in the early hours. That fact, a chaplain killed in a combat zone he'd entered voluntarily, carrying no weapon, performing work that was specifically about what to do when men die, sits differently than the other casualty figures. He was counted in the same administrative columns as everyone else, killed in action. He'd left no letter with another chaplain for himself.
Chapter 8.
Utah Beach was not the whole story. At 6:30 in the morning on the 6th of June 1944, the men of the 4th Infantry Division climbed out of their landing craft and waded onto Utah Beach. They'd been waiting offshore since the night before, in the vessels that carried them across the channel, while the men they were depending on, the Airborne, had been fighting inland for more than 5 hours. The beach itself had been struck by naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. The German defences on Utah were not the organised, intact defensive system that the men hitting Omaha Beach further east would encounter. They were disrupted, partially suppressed, and, in the sector where the first wave actually landed, positioned to cover a different stretch of beach than the one the landings actually hit. The 4th Division landed approximately 300 metres south of its intended point. They didn't know that. The officer in command of the first wave, looking at the beach defences in front of him, made the decision to attack where he was, rather than shift north to the intended sector. Good call. That decision probably saved hundreds of lives. The Utah casualty figure is one of the most cited numbers in D-Day history, and it's worth examining precisely what it measures. 21,000 men landed at Utah Beach on the 6th of June. 197 of them were killed. The D-Day Story Historical Archive in Portsmouth puts it plainly. 197 deaths among the beach landing force, the fewest of any D-Day landing sector. That's less than 1%. Against the carnage of Omaha, where approximately 2,400 were killed or wounded, Utah looks like a different operation. Calmer, more controlled, less deadly. And in raw terms it was. But the number has to be read in its full context, which means acknowledging what was happening 5 miles inland at roughly the same time.
The 2,499 airborne casualties on the 6th of June. The combined figure for both divisions from Gordon Harrison's cross-channel attack represents more than 12 times the Utah Beach death toll. The men who secured the causeways and the road junctions that made Utah workable paid, in aggregate, a price that dwarfs the beach casualty figure. That's not a criticism of Utah's success. It's an observation about where the actual fighting was concentrated on D-Day. The beach became the symbol of the invasion because it's visible. Landing craft, surf, sand, the drama of amphibious assault. What happened in the hedgerows 5 miles west wasn't visible to anyone who wasn't there. I find myself returning to this imbalance when I look at how the campaign has been written about in the decades since. The beach operations are documented in photographs and film. The airborne scatter, men landing alone in dark fields,
improvising their way toward objectives that no camera followed, is documented almost entirely in after-action reports, unit histories, and the accounts veterans gave years later. The visual record shapes the historical memory. What got photographed became the story. The men in the hedgerows at 2 in the morning, who made the beach possible, are in the administrative record. The men on the beach are on the newsreel. The communications picture on D-Day illustrates, from a different angle, what the operational reality looked like for the commanders trying to direct the battle. The 82nd Airborne Division's after-action report, compiled at the Eisenhower Library and available through the dday-overlord.com archive, records that only one of 3 SCR-193 radios that landed with the division on D-Day was operative. The SCR-193 was the division's primary means of communicating with higher headquarters. A Jeep-mounted set with a range of 25 to 100 miles, providing both Morse code and voice capability. 2 out of 3 destroyed or non-functional on landing. That meant the division's command post, established by Major General Ridgway's headquarters after he jumped with his men on the night of June 5th to 6th, was operating for most of D-Day without the ability to communicate with its corps commander or with the adjacent 4th Infantry Division. Radio contact with the 4th Division wasn't established until the night of the 6th to 7th, more than 17 hours after the drops began. The 7th Corps commander, General J. Lawton Collins, visited the 82nd Airborne Division's command post late on D-Day, according to the after-action report. That visit, recorded as a single line in the administrative log, represents the first time the Corps commander and the Airborne Divisional commander had been in the same physical location since before the operation began. Everything before that visit, every decision Ridgway made about where to commit his available forces, every assessment of the tactical situation, was made on the basis of whatever information was reaching the command post by runner, by the one working radio, and by the reports of officers who'd walked in from the field. The command picture was fragmentary. It was the picture the battle produced, not the picture the plan had assumed. The seaborne tail echelon of the 82nd, commanded by Brigadier General George Howell, had landed at Utah Beach and was moving inland to link up with the division. The after-action report records that the seaborne element, which included tanks from Company C of the 746th Tank Battalion and additional support troops, landed at Utah at approximately 1400 hours on the 6th of June and moved inland toward the division's positions. Those tanks were the first armor available to a division that had been fighting without it since before midnight. Their arrival in the afternoon of D-Day, 14 hours after the parachute drops began, closed one of the most significant capability gaps in the airborne forces' defensive posture around the murder ray. Until they arrived, the anti-armor defense of the Lafayette Bridge area rested on bazookas and the 6 57mm guns that had been recovered from the glider landings. The after-action report's record of D-Day ends with a figure that has shaped every subsequent interpretation of the operation. By nightfall, approximately 30% of the division's forces were under control. That figure comes from the dday-overlord.com compilation of the divisional after-action data. It is recorded without editorial commentary in the report itself. A data point among data points, a percentage in a column of operational status assessments. What it means is that 70% of the division, roughly 5,000 men from a formation of about 7,500, were not under command when the first day of the Normandy invasion ended. They were somewhere in the Carentan, in various states of organization, having conducted or being in the process of conducting the improvised, distributed battle that the scatter had produced. Utah Beach had 197 killed. The Airborne had 2,499 casualties. The beach worked. The equation was written in those two numbers. Chapter 9. The Bridge That Held. The bridge at Lafayette is a small stone structure crossing the Meurderay River just west of Sainte-Mère Eglise. In the summer of 1944, It sat at the end of a raised causeway, approximately 500 meters of elevated earth road, crossing flooded marshland that the Germans had deliberately inundated. From the eastern bank, looking west, you could see the causeway stretching across open water to the far bank, where the ground rose again toward German-held territory.
There was no cover on the causeway. None. You were on a road above water, with open sight lines in every direction, and anything that wanted to shoot at you from the western bank had an unobstructed line. The bridge was seized by American paratroopers in the early hours of the 6th of June, 1944. Holding it, and then eventually assaulting across it, would take 4 more days and cost more than 250 American lives. The seizure of Lafayette in the first hours of the drop was the one piece of the mercenary plan that went recognizably according to design. Paratroopers from the regiment assigned to the drop zones east of the river, the formation that had achieved the most concentrated drop, also responsible for Sainte-Mère-Eglise, moved toward the bridge through the early morning darkness and reached it around first light. The D-Day-Overlord.com after-action compilation records the initial seizure and the subsequent fighting at the bridge, noting that at 13:30 hours on D-Day, the glider element of a neighboring unit joined forces to assist in the attack. What they found when they held the bridge's eastern end was a tactical problem with no clean solution. They were on one side of a flooded river, the German forces were on the other, and the only route across was a road with no cover that ran 500 meters under fire. Brigadier General James Gavin, second in command of the 82nd, who had jumped with the parachute assault echelon on the night of June 5th to 6th, made his way to the Lafayette area during D-Day. The D-Day-Overlord.com Lafayette page describes Gavin advancing through the marshes bordering the Mercenary before joining forces at the bridge. Gavin was 37 years old and had already commanded combat jumps in Sicily and Italy. He understood what the bridge represented operationally. It was the Mercenary crossing that, if held on the eastern side, anchored the entire western flank of the Airborne perimeter. Losing it to a German counterattack would open the division's left flank and potentially allow German forces to push east toward Utah Beach. Holding it, however costly, was non-negotiable in the operational logic of the campaign. The German counterattacks at Lafayette on D-Day and the days following used armoured vehicles, specifically tanks that had been captured from French forces in 1940 and pressed into German service. The Warfare History Network account of the Lafayette battle notes that American paratroopers used their bazookas to good effect in halting these counterattacks. The bazooka, the M9A1 rocket launcher used by American infantry, could penetrate approximately 4 inches of armor at 500 yards, and the captured French tanks the Germans were using at Lafayette weren't particularly well armored by 1944 standards. They were stopped. But stopping them required men in exposed positions with shoulder-fired weapons, engaging vehicles at close range, without the benefit of the anti-tank guns that were supposed to have been delivered by the glider wave and largely weren't available in the numbers planned. The 4-day battle for Lafayette, from the 6th to the 9th of June, produced what the National World War II Museum's documentary account calls probably the bloodiest small unit struggle in the experience of American arms, with more than 250 American lives lost. On the 9th of June, D+3, glider infantry made a daylight assault across the causeway itself. This is the moment that the planning had always envisioned as the culminating action at the Mercenary, a crossing to the western bank to secure the bridgehead that would allow the subsequent push toward Cherbourg. In practice, it happened 3 days later than planned, with a force that had been fighting continuously and absorbing casualties since the drop, conducting a frontal assault across 500 meters of open road with no cover against a prepared German defensive position. That assault succeeded. 250 lives is the cost the National World War II Museum attributes to Lafayette overall. The bridge was approximately 15 meters long. Me thinking about that ratio
15 meters of bridge, 250 lives, 4 days, is not a comfortable exercise, and I don't want to frame it in a way that suggests the sacrifice was disproportionate or avoidable. The Mercenary crossing was operationally essential. The Germans understood that holding the western bank denied the Americans a route off the Carentan that the whole subsequent campaign needed. Both sides understood the bridge's value and fought accordingly. What I find difficult is the gap between the planning document's confident allocation of specific grid references and the reality of a causeway assault on day 4, by a force already significantly degraded from its jumping strength, conducting an operation that the plan had expected to be complete on day 1. That gap isn't a failure of courage or commitment. It's a measure of how different the actual operation was from the planned one. The glider infantry that conducted the D+3 causeway assault at Lafayette were part of the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, the glider element of the 82nd Airborne, which had arrived in 2 waves, the first at 4 minutes past 4 on D-Day morning, and the second at 2100 hours on the same evening, which brought approximately 100 gliders with artillery, engineers, and specialist troops, as documented in the Divisional After-Action Report. By D+3, the regiment had absorbed its own casualty rate and had been in continuous operation for 72 hours. The Facebook account citing divisional records from May 2024 notes that after just 4 days into the Normandy campaign, the casualty rate of the 325th Glider Infantry was already severe. These were the men who crossed the causeway. They walked out from behind the eastern bank's slight cover onto 500 meters of open road above the flooded Mercenary, and they kept moving. The bridge is still there. The causeway is still there. The flooded marshes have been partially drained since the war. The deliberate inundation was reversed once the German occupation ended. The ground that was underwater in June 1944 is now farmland. Standing on the causeway today, looking west, you can measure 500 meters with your eye and understand immediately what the men who crossed it on the 9th of June, 1944, were walking into. Understanding and feeling are different things. The bridge itself doesn't communicate what it cost. That's what the records are for. Chapter 10. What the Seaborne Couldn't See. When the 4th Infantry Division's lead elements came ashore at Utah Beach on the morning of the 6th of June, they had been at sea for hours and in sustained preparation for the operation for months. They had briefing maps. They had intelligence assessments of the German defensive positions on the beach. What they didn't have, what nobody on the beach had in the early hours, was a clear picture of what was happening 5 miles inland, in the hedgerow country where the Airborne had been fighting since before midnight. The beach and the interior were effectively separate operational theatres on D-Day morning, separated not by distance, but by information. No one on Utah Beach knew, when they waded ashore at 6:30, that only 30% of the 82nd Airborne was under divisional control. They knew the Airborne had jumped. They didn't know what it had landed into. This information gap is worth dwelling on, because it shaped what the beach commanders could and couldn't plan for in the first hours after landing. If the Airborne had achieved its objectives on something approaching the planned timeline, regiments concentrated at their assigned bridgeheads, anti-tank guns in position, the Mercenary crossings secured, then the 4th Infantry Division could move inland through open terrain with the reasonable expectation of airborne units waiting at the causeway exits. What actually awaited them was something more complicated. Scattered groups of paratroopers who had in many cases reached their assigned objectives or nearby equivalents, but without the organic support or communications infrastructure the plan had assumed. The causeway exits were in American hands. The situation west of the causeways was considerably less clear. The seaborne tail echelon of the 82nd Airborne, the support elements that travelled by sea rather than by air, had embarked from Bristol, according to the divisional after-action report, and landed at Utah Beach at approximately 1400 hours on June 6th. They brought with them Company C of the 746th Tank Battalion, additional artillery, and the logistical tail that a division in sustained combat requires to function. But they arrived 7 hours after the beach landings began, and their movement inland through the causeway system added their vehicles and personnel to the flow of 4th Division troops already moving west. The causeway bottleneck that the Airborne had been tasked with keeping open was being used, throughout the afternoon, by a stream of vehicles and men trying to link up with the scattered Airborne perimeter. The 7th Corps commander, General Collins, visiting the 82nd's command post late on D-Day, would have received from Ridgway a picture of the battle that was necessarily incomplete. One working radio, runners bringing reports from units that were themselves partially unassembled, a divisional perimeter held at 30% strength. This was the operational situation that Collins needed to understand in order to direct the subsequent phase of the campaign. The after-action report records the visit without quoting the conversation, which is the nature of after-action reports. What was said between a corps commander and a divisional general in a field command post in Normandy at the end of D-Day isn't recoverable from the administrative record. What we know is that Collins visited, that contact was established with the 4th Infantry Division during the day, and that the division continued to function as a coherent operational unit despite its condition. The contrast between what D-Day looked like from a map room in England and what it looked like from the command post of an airborne division in Normandy is the kind of contrast that institutional histories tend to flatten. From a map room, the operation produced results. Sainte-Mère-Eglise was taken, the causeways were opened, Utah Beach landed 21,000 men with 197 killed. Those were real achievements, and they appeared on the map as coloured arrows and shaded zones indicating Allied control. What the map didn't show was the administrative reality underneath the coloured zones. 30% strength, 2 radios down, battalion commanders killed at 15 of 16, resupply bundles in the water or in German hands. The map showed that the Airborne held the ground. It didn't show what holding the ground had cost at the unit level. I want to be specific about the resupply figure, because it captures the gap between the plan and the reality in a way that's easy to quantify. On D+1, the 7th of June, 148 C-47s out of 248 dispatched arrived over the 82nd's area and delivered 155.5 tons. The dday-overlord.com after-action compilation records that the drop pattern was poor and that many bundles fell into enemy hands or were covered by enemy fire and couldn't be recovered. 74% of planned material delivered with poor distribution. For a division fighting at 30% strength without organic artillery, 26% of the planned resupply gone, lost to German-held fields, or simply never found, was not an abstraction. It was the medical supplies that a battalion aid station didn't receive, the ammunition that a machine gun crew couldn't get, the rations that men who'd been fighting for 30 hours went without. The beach, by contrast, had its supply chain functioning with the relative efficiency of a major port operation. Utah Beach was designed to receive materiel at scale, and by D-Day afternoon, it was beginning to operate as intended. Vehicles rolling off landing craft, ammunition and rations coming ashore in organized convoys, the logistics of a modern army establishing itself on a functioning beachhead. The contrast with the Airborne situation, improvised resupply at 74% efficiency with poor drop patterns, illustrates the fundamental asymmetry of the two operations sharing the same D-Day date. The beach was a logistics system. The Airborne was a fighting force consuming itself in the hedgerows, while the logistics system came ashore behind it. What the Seaborne couldn't see and what the beach records don't capture, is the scale of what the Airborne's improvised performance actually required from its individual members. The planning documents had allocated specific tasks to specific units at specific times. When those units were at 25 or 30% strength, scattered across terrain they hadn't rehearsed, the tasks still needed doing, by whoever was available, with whatever they had.
That transfer of burden from the plan to the individual is the operational reality that the after-action report's administrative language can only partially convey. 30% strength is a number. Behind it are individuals who, on the 6th of June, 1944, were doing the work of 3. Chapter 11. Carentan, the operation that wasn't over. There's a common misconception in how D-Day is remembered, and it's not about any particular fact. It's about duration. The dominant cultural memory of D-Day is concentrated on the 6th of June, the night drop, the beach landings, the first day's fighting. What this framing systematically obscures is that the airborne operation wasn't a single day's work. The 101st Airborne Division, whose causeways had opened Utah Beach by midday on June 6th, spent the next 2 weeks fighting a separate campaign to capture the town of Carentan, a campaign that cost additional hundreds of lives and that the planning documents had anticipated but not resourced for at a scale that reflected what it actually required. Carentan was the road junction that linked Utah Beach's sector to Omaha Beach's sector. Without Carentan in Allied hands, the 2 American beachheads were separated by a German-held town, and the ability to combine the forces from both beaches into a coherent front was compromised. The strategic logic of taking Carentan was as clear as the logic of taking the causeways. You needed it, it was in the way, and the forces tasked with taking it were the same airborne division that had already been fighting for 5 days since the jump. The 101st's paratroopers weren't a fresh force by the 10th of June, 1944, when the Carentan battle formally began. They were men who'd been in continuous combat since before midnight on June 5th to 6th, on reduced resupply, with casualties already accumulating across their battalions. The approach to Carentan had its own bottleneck problem, eerily similar to Lafayette. The road into the town from the north ran across a series of causeways over flooded ground. The same engineering logic the Germans had applied throughout the Carentan. The Battlefield Travels account of the battle, drawing on the Army University Press staff ride materials, documents that the assault involved both a regiment that had been fighting the causeway approach and a second formation that had been tasked with the flanking movement. The regiment that had approached along the causeways had taken significant casualties in the approach, and by the time the town itself was assaulted, a second regiment had to be brought forward to lead the attack. The Facebook account citing the World War in Color historical series records the sequence. The Causeway Regiment was too exhausted to continue, and another regiment took charge. The town fell on the 10th of June, 1944. The casualty figures for Carentan are staggering in context. The Warfare History Network's account of the battle notes that the 101st Airborne Division suffered 150% casualties, meaning the division's losses exceeded its original strength because replacements cycling in during the fighting were themselves becoming casualties before the fighting ended. At least 400 killed in the Carentan engagement alone, per the Wikipedia battle summary. The division that had secured Utah Beach's causeways, with 546 known dead through the entire Normandy campaign, sustained a significant portion of those losses in the Carentan fighting that followed D-Day. The campaign wasn't over when the beaches were secured. The campaign was just beginning. The German force defending Carentan was composed of paratroopers, professional soldiers from the German 6th Parachute Regiment, specifically positioned in the Carentan as a reserve formation. They weren't a disorganized local garrison. They were trained airborne infantry, familiar with the terrain, defending a position they'd had days to prepare. The 101st Airborne was fighting its opposite number,
Paratroopers against paratroopers. Both sides trained for exactly this kind of close defensive battle in hedgerow country. Both sides willing to contest every field boundary and every drainage ditch. The National World War II Museum's Forgotten Fights article on Carentan, written by historian Mitch Yockelson, documents that when the Americans were overrun by German infantry with self-propelled guns during the counterattack following the initial capture of the town, it was a regiment's prompt response that stabilized the line. The town changed hands in terms of pressure, if not in terms of formal control, before the American position was consolidated. By the time Carentan was secured and the German counterattack beaten back, around the 13th and 14th of June, the 101st Airborne Division was, in practical terms, a spent force. It had been in continuous combat for 8 days. It had absorbed losses that far exceeded its planning projections, and its surviving men were exhausted at a level that no amount of unit-level morale could fully compensate for. The division's total Normandy casualties, 4,670 through the 30th of June, including 546 killed, 2,217 wounded, and 1,907 missing, accumulated across this entire period, from the night drop through the Carentan battle and beyond. D-Day was the beginning of the accounting, not its conclusion. The planning documents had identified Carentan as an objective. They had allocated forces to take it. What they hadn't fully modelled was the cumulative state of those forces by the time the Carentan battle had to be fought. Men who'd already spent days in sustained combat at reduced strength, with improvised logistics and depleted ammunition. An operation that requires a fresh force to fight effectively was assigned to a force that was anything but fresh. That's not a criticism of the planner's intentions. It's an observation about the gap between operational planning, which necessarily works with projected force conditions, and operational reality, which works with the actual condition of men who've been fighting for days on inadequate supply. The Airborne's achievement at Carentan was genuine. It was also extracted from people who had very little left to give. Chapter 12. The number in the report. The 82nd Airborne Division's after-action report for D-Day, archived at the Eisenhower Library and compiled on the ddayoverlord.com research platform, contains a figure that appears almost without emphasis in the flow of operational data it records. By nightfall, approximately 30% of the division's forces were under control. That's it. One sentence. 1 percentage point. No analytical commentary. No comparison to what the plan had projected. No assessment of what it meant for the operational situation facing the division over the next 24 hours. The report moves on to the next item. At 2100 hours, 100 gliders landed with artillery, engineers, and special troops. Administrative continuity. The percentage point sits there, surrounded by times and grid references, and it's easy to read past. I've read past it before, and I want to be honest about that. The first time I encountered that figure in the source documentation, I was moving through the after-action data looking for something else. The resupply figures, the radio status, and the 30% didn't fully register. It took a second reading, slower, thinking about what the planning documents had assumed, to understand what that number was measuring. The plan had assumed a division that would be, by daylight on June 6th, substantially assembled at its assigned objectives, capable of executing coordinated regimental operations against specific German positions. What the 30% figure describes is the opposite. Radio communications with the 4th Division were eventually achieved. But what both sides were exchanging was an operational picture that was still being assembled in real time. Nobody on either side of that contact on the 6th of June had a complete picture of where the scattered elements of the Airborne were, what they were doing, or what condition they were in. The picture was being constructed, fragment by fragment, as runners came in and radios were repaired and officers walked out of the hedgerows to report. The seaborne arrival of the support echelon, Company C of the 746th Tank Battalion, additional artillery, logistical support, at approximately 1400 hours on D-Day, was the first significant augmentation of the division's capability since the glider landings in the early morning. The tanks represented an anti-armor capability that the division had been fighting without since the drop. By 1750 hours, as recorded in the after-action data, 6 57mm anti-tank guns from the 80mm Airborne Anti-Aircraft Battalion were in position, out of 16 that had been allocated to the glider wave. 6 out of 16. The remaining 10 were either inaccessible in wrecked gliders, lost in flooded terrain, or simply not yet located. That gap, 10 anti-tank guns unaccounted for, was the difference between a planned anti-armor capability and the improvised one that had actually defended Lafayette through the day. The administrative language of after-action reports creates a specific problem for understanding what operations actually felt like from the inside. Every entry in the report is in the same voice, factual, sequential, stripped of emotional content. By nightfall, approximately 30% of the division's forces were under control, and, at 2100 hours, 100 gliders landed, are recorded in the same flat administrative register, as if they have the same weight. They don't. The first sentence describes a formation that is, by any standard planning metric, non-functional as a division. The second describes a reinforcement that materially improved its situation. Both are true. The report gives you both equally, without any framework for weighing one against the other. The 30% figure is where this account has to end its first extended look at D-Day proper, because it's the number that defines everything that follows. The Lafayette battle, the Carentan fighting, the resupply problems, the casualty accumulation through June. It's not the number that appears on the posters or in the documentaries. Those tend to lead with 13,000 men, or with the beach landings, or with the Sainte-Mère Eglise flag. 30% is the administrative residue of what happened when the plan met the actual conditions of the Carentan Peninsula on a cloudy night in early June, with anti-aircraft fire and flooded fields and maps that couldn't show you where you'd actually landed. The men who made up that 30%, in command and under control, held the mercenary, took the town, and opened the causeways. The 70% who weren't counted in it were also there, in the dark. The ledger for both groups comes next. Chapter 13. The Scattered Regiment. The after-action record for the 82nd Airborne Division, compiled at the Eisenhower Library and archived on the D-Day Overlord research platform, contains a single sentence about the regiment assigned to land west of the Mercenary River on the night of the 5th to 6th of June, 1944. It says, essentially, that by 1900 hours, that's 7 in the evening, 17 hours after the first men hit the ground, the regiment stood at approximately 25% of its effective strength, 1 man in 4, under command. The other 3 were somewhere out in the dark of the Carentan, either individually or in small groups, cut off from every radio, every map reference, and every officer they'd spent months training alongside. That sentence in the report is quiet, administrative. It doesn't shout. And that restraint is almost the most disturbing thing about it. To understand what 25% effective strength actually meant, you have to understand what this regiment was supposed to do. It was assigned to land west of the Mercenary, roughly 1,000 yards north of a small crossroads village called Amfreville, and then seize and hold bridgeheads across the river, positions that would prevent German armour from reaching the Mercenary crossings that the adjacent regiment was simultaneously trying to secure from the east. It was a two-sided pincer on a narrow river, which, if it worked, would lock the Germans in place and open the road for the infantry divisions coming ashore at Utah Beach later that morning. If it didn't work, if one side of the pincer failed, the whole geometry collapsed. And the geometry did collapse. Not catastrophically, not irreversibly, but enough that the battle fought along the Meurderay on the 6th of June looked nothing like the plan drawn up in England. What happened to the regiment in the air is documented in the post-war USAF historical study on airborne operations in the European theatre. Weather, anti-aircraft fire, and broken formations combined to scatter the sticks across an area far wider than the designated drop zone. Some aircraft released their men early, pilots reacting to flak with altitude changes and course deviations that shifted the exit point by a mile or more. 1 mile at jump altitude, with a wind of even 5 miles per hour and a descent of roughly 30 seconds, moves a man a considerable distance from where the planning documents said he would land. Multiply that by hundreds of sticks, each of 18 men or so, each subject to its own specific combination of wind and release point, and you get not a regiment in formation, but a scattered constellation of men distributed across marshland, hedgerows, flooded fields, and the occasional tree. Separated from each other, often without the specific landmark that would tell them where they actually were. The flooded terrain was particularly punishing. The Germans had deliberately blocked drainage sluices throughout the Meurderay Valley during the occupation, converting what maps showed as fields into stretches of standing water, anywhere from knee-deep to chest-deep in places. Men who landed in these areas, wearing 70 to 90 pounds of equipment, had seconds to release their harnesses before the weight pulled them under. Some managed it, some didn't. The exact number who drowned in the flooded Meurderay lowlands on that night isn't cleanly captured in any after-action report I've examined, because the casualty categories, killed, wounded, missing, didn't distinguish cause of death or method of loss. Drowning in a flooded Norman field at 2 a.m, alone, is recorded the same way as being shot in a hedgerow fight at noon. Missing. By around 1000 hours on June 6th, a scratch force had assembled on the western bank near Amfreville, roughly 300 men drawn from scattered elements of the regiment, and some men from a neighbouring unit who'd also landed wide of their zones. 300, out of a regiment that had crossed the Channel with approximately 2,000. That's 15%, not 25%. The figure climbed through the day as more men found their way to assembly points. But the morning number is the one that mattered most operationally, because that's when the Germans were still capable of mounting a coordinated response. 300 men in the hedgerows west of a flooded river, with limited radio contact and improvised command, holding against whatever the 91st Division could throw at them. I find it genuinely difficult to map what I know about military operations onto what those men were doing. They weren't executing a plan. They were improvising one. The Army University Press Normandy staff ride materials describe what happened at Amfreville in terms of small group initiative. Officers and senior NCOs who landed found the nearest man they recognized, pointed at the map, and started moving. Colonel George Millett, the regimental commander, landed west of Amfreville. His executive officer landed somewhere else. Most of his battalion commanders were cut off from their units for hours. What the regiment was doing in those first hours wasn't regimental operations. It was distributed, individual-scale problem-solving by men who'd been trained to operate as part of a larger machine, and found themselves operating alone instead. Some moved toward their assigned objectives by different routes than planned and arrived hours late. Some found different objectives entirely and attacked those. Captain Rex Combs, documented in the 508th Regimental Records, reached the town of Chef du Pont with a small group and secured a bridge over the Meurderay, an action not written into the plan, taken by a captain with a handful of men, because the bridge was there, and they were there, and no one else was. That bridge is now named after him. What the scatter actually cost, in operational terms, was time. Every hour that the regiment spent reassembling, reorienting, and patching together a coherent force was an hour the Germans had to recover from their own shock and begin organizing a response. The 91st Division, whose commander was dead by early morning, more on that shortly, was disorganized in its own right. But disorganization has a recovery arc, and a regiment at 25% strength couldn't press that disorganization hard enough, fast enough, to prevent the Germans from eventually establishing defensive positions on the western Mercenary bank. By 1900 hours, the after-action report records that the regiment at 25% strength had pushed the enemy back to the west bank of the Mercenary in its sector. It held. But holding a line and seizing a bridgehead are different things, and the plan had called for a bridgehead. The resupply that arrived the following day provides a concrete measure of what had been lost. On the 7th of June, 148 out of 248 C-47s dispatched for aerial resupply arrived over the division's area and dropped 155.5 tons of supplies. That figure is from the after-action report compiled at the Eisenhower Library. The drop pattern was poor. The same report records that many bundles fell into enemy hands or were covered by enemy fire and couldn't be recovered. For a regiment at a quarter of its effective strength, operating without its organic artillery, the pack howitzers were largely lost in the scatter. The lost bundles weren't just a logistics inconvenience. They were medical supplies that didn't reach medics, ammunition that didn't reach machine gun crews, rations for men who'd been fighting on whatever they'd jumped with for more than 30 hours. The 155.5 tons that did arrive represented 74% of what was planned. The 26% that didn't, roughly 54 tons by weight, went somewhere else. The regiment recovered. By D+1 and through the days that followed, strength climbed as more scattered men found their units, as the seaborne tail echelon came ashore, as the glider element added reinforcements. The regiment fought through the Mercenary battles, eventually helping to secure the crossings that the plan had originally assigned them. But the document that captures the first 24 hours doesn't describe that recovery. It describes a unit at 1 man in 4, fighting with what it had, in terrain that wasn't on its rehearsal maps. And the weight of what those 3 men in 4 were doing, each alone, each making individual decisions in darkness and confusion, is something the percentage figure doesn't really contain. 25% is an administrative summary. What it summarizes is a night full of individual calculation, improvisation, and the particular loneliness of a soldier who doesn't know where his unit is. Chapter 14. The General Who Drove Home. On the night of the 5th to 6th of June, 1944, the commander of the German 91st Infantry Division was not at his headquarters. He was in Rennes. That's roughly 125 miles from the Carentan Peninsula, where his division was positioned as a mobile reserve, specifically designed to counterattack an Allied airborne landing. The reason General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falli was in Rennes wasn't negligence, it was orders. His army commander, General Friedrich Dollmann, had instructed all the divisional commanders in his area to come to Rennes for a war game, an exercise in which they would practice exactly the response that was, at that very moment, becoming necessary. The Allies were coming, and the men who'd been told to spend the night playing at defending against them were 125 miles from the thing they were supposed to defend. This is one of those pieces of historical coincidence that I'm always careful about, because the temptation is to treat it as the decisive fact, the hinge on which everything turned. And it isn't, quite. But it is genuinely significant, and it's significant in a specific, documented way that goes beyond dramatic irony. The 91st Division was the formation most directly positioned to counterattack the airborne drop zones.
It had been placed on the Carentan partly because German intelligence had assessed that an Allied airborne landing in that area was a realistic threat. And it was the unit whose intervention in the first hours of the airborne operation could have been most damaging. Its commander, being away from his headquarters at the moment the drops began, meant that the division entered the most critical phase of its existence without the man most capable of directing its response. Fally was apparently on the road back to his headquarters when he heard or was told about the airborne landings. The Army University Press Normandy staff ride materials record the essential fact. Fally was killed in a paratrooper ambush while returning from Rennes to his headquarters near Picauville. The WW2 gravestone.com record, citing the historical literature, attributes the action to Malcolm Brannan of the 82nd Airborne. The Warfare History Network account of the Carentan operation includes a period German account, in which a German officer describes finding the divisional commander shot dead on the side of the road. Fally died on the approach to the chateau that served as the 91st's headquarters, a building his men were still in when American paratroopers arrived in the area. He didn't know, as he drove north through the darkness, that the building he was hurrying toward had already been reached by scattered men from the airborne drop. I want to be precise about what the historical record does and doesn't say here. The accounts of the Fally ambush are consistent on the key facts. He died near Picauville in the early hours of June 6th, killed by American paratroopers from a scattered unit in the 82nd Airborne area. But they're not consistent on every detail of how the encounter unfolded. That's not surprising. Ambushes in the dark, involving men who were themselves disoriented and improvising, rarely produce clean after-action accounts. What the record is clear on is the outcome and its timing. The commander of the division best positioned to counterattack the airborne landings was killed within roughly the first 2 hours of those landings, at the very moment his division needed direction most. The operational consequence of Fally's death isn't best described as paralysis. The 91st Division continued to fight. It continued to hold positions along the Murderette, and it continued to apply pressure on scattered airborne units throughout June 6th and the days that followed. What his death changed was the decision-making architecture at the top of the divisional command. A divisional commander in 1944 was not just a tactical figurehead. He was the person with the authority to commit mobile reserves, to direct artillery support, to coordinate between regimental commanders who might otherwise act at cross purposes. His operations officer could relay information. He couldn't authorize a major counterattack without approval from above. And above, 7th Army Headquarters, Army Group B, was still processing the scale and location of the Allied assault, still debating whether the Normandy landings were the main invasion or a feint designed to draw reserves away from the Pas de Calais. The 91st Division sat in a command vacuum during a period when every hour of German inaction was an hour the scattered American paratroopers used to reassemble. Fally had inspected his headquarters positions with Field Marshal Rommel in May 1944. The photograph from that visit, Rommel and Fally on the steps of Château de Berneville, has become one of the more visible documents of the Normandy pre-invasion period. It was taken perhaps 3 weeks before the general in that photograph drove north through darkness, trying to get back to the building in the background. That gap between the photograph and the ambush, 3 weeks, during which everything that could go wrong in the timing of a German commander's movements conspired to go wrong simultaneously, is one of those historical gaps that feels almost too pointed to be random. It wasn't. It was the product of a German command culture that had made a collectively rational decision, wargame the response scenario, that became individually catastrophic. The scenario arrived during the game. The 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the unit whose scattered elements encountered Fally,
had itself landed in considerable disarray on the night of the drop. The regiment's own records, preserved in the executive summary compiled by Regimental Association founder O.B. Hill, and cited in previous sections of this account, document 1,161 casualties during the Normandy campaign, 336 killed, 487 wounded, 173 injured, 165 missing. Out of 2,056 men who made the jump, that's a loss rate across the full campaign of roughly 56%. The men who killed Fally were part of a regiment that was simultaneously being consumed at that rate. They were not a sharp, organized force executing a planned decapitation strike. They were scattered soldiers in an unknown field who encountered a car moving toward a position they happened to be occupying. That distinction matters enormously for how we interpret what happened. Modern special operations doctrine includes decapitation operations, targeted strikes on enemy command nodes, planned, coordinated, resourced. Fally's death by scattered paratroopers in the dark was nothing like that. It was chance, proximity, and the particular kind of lethal improvisation that a well-trained soldier applies when he's alone in the dark and an unknown vehicle appears on the road in front of him.
The paratroopers who conducted the ambush didn't know who was in the car. They found out afterward. And the fact that what they found out was the identity of the commanding general of the German formation most directly positioned to destroy the entire airborne operations murder rate flank is one of those facts that no plan could have produced and no historian can fully account for. What the 91st Division did for the rest of June 6th without its commander was fight. Hold defensive positions, apply pressure, conduct localized counterattacks. But it didn't mount the kind of coordinated, divisional-scale response to the airborne landings that Fally might have directed if he'd been at his headquarters when the drops began. Whether that response would have succeeded, whether even a fully directed 91st Division could have overcome the surprise, the scale, and the geographic distribution of the airborne assault, is a question the historical record can't answer. Fally died before the question could be tested, and the gap his death created, in the 2 critical hours between the airborne drops and the Utah beach landings, was time the scattered Americans used to survive. Chapter 15. The Road Through the Water. Utah Beach and the Causeway Problem. The 4 causeways that ran westward from Utah Beach through the flooded lowlands of the Carentan were, by the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, the only routes available to any force trying to move inland from the beach. Each of them was a raised earth road, built across ground that the Germans had deliberately inundated since the previous year, crossing perhaps half a mile of standing water that was impassable to vehicles and treacherous for infantry. If you were climbing off a landing craft at Utah Beach, wading ashore under fire, and trying to move inland toward the objectives assigned to the 4th Infantry Division, you had 4 choices of route, and every one of them was a narrow bottleneck that a small number of determined defenders could close. The beach wasn't the problem. The causeways were the problem. And the problem was supposed to have been solved before the sun came up. The mission of one of the 2 airborne divisions on D-Day was structured significantly around this reality. Causeways numbered 1 through 4, running from south to north behind the beach, had their western exits in towns and villages that the airborne was tasked with securing before the seaborne landing began at 6:30 in the morning. Secure the western exits, and the 4th Infantry Division could move inland freely, or at least without being funneled through contested bottlenecks. Fail to secure them, and the division was channeling 20,000 men through a series of narrow roads that even modest German resistance could turn into catastrophes. The National World War II Museum's documented account of the airborne invasion states that the causeways were secured by approximately 7:30 in the morning, and that the link-up with the 4th Infantry Division near Causeway 2 occurred around midday on June 6th. 7:30 and midday.
The beach landings began at 6:30. The timing tells you most of what you need to know about the margin. The work of securing the causeway exits was done, like almost everything else in the airborne operation, by men who hadn't landed where they were supposed to. Scattered sticks had to find each other in the dark, establish which direction was west. The causeways ran west to east toward the beach, and move toward objectives that some of them had studied on briefing maps and others hadn't, because their actual landing point was so far from their planned one that the maps in their pockets weren't showing the right terrain. What they found when they reached the western ends of the causeways were German positions, not in great strength in most cases, but positioned to cover the approaches. The engagement at the village of Pooperville, near Causeway 1, produced a fight in the early morning hours that cleared the exit and opened the road for the infantry coming inland from the beach. The YouTube historical account from August 2025 specifically identifies Pooperville as the site of the link-up between the 101st Airborne and the 4th Infantry Division. Midday. The link-up happened around midday. The beach landings had begun at 6:30. That's roughly 6 hours during which the 4th Infantry Division was moving inland through or near causeways that were being contested or had only just been cleared. Utah's casualty figures, approximately 197 killed, the lowest of any D-Day landing sector, reflect several things simultaneously. The accidental navigation error that landed the first wave 300 meters south of its intended point, placing it in a less heavily defended area. The effects of pre-landing naval and air bombardment, and the degree to which the airborne's work in the hours before the beach landing had degraded the German defensive capability on the western approach. Separating out how much each factor contributed is, frankly, impossible from the existing documentary record, and I've seen enough confident attributions of Utah's low casualties to a single cause to be skeptical of any of them. General Maxwell Taylor, commanding the 101st Airborne, had spent the first hours of D-Day in a situation that would have tested a company commander, let alone a divisional general. He'd landed some distance from his planned assembly point, and in the early hours of June 6th, found himself with approximately 12 men, documented in the post-war historical accounts of his division. 12 men, out of more than 6,000 who jumped. He spent those hours moving through Norman hedgerows in the dark, adding men as he found them, building toward the kind of command group that could actually direct an operation, while simultaneously trying to determine what his division had accomplished and what it still needed to do. That experience, general officer with 12 men in a dark field at 2 a.m, is a compressed version of everything that was simultaneously happening across the entire airborne operation. Everyone was improvising. Everyone was reassembling. The question was only whether the improvisation produced the necessary results fast enough to matter. The causeways provide the clearest answer to that question because they have a verifiable outcome. They were open. The 4th Infantry Division moved inland. Utah Beach worked. Connecting those facts requires some analytical care. The causeways being open was necessary for Utah's success, but not the only factor in it. But the connection is real. The airborne operation's most concrete, documentable contribution to the D-Day outcome is those 4 roads across the water, their western ends in American hands by a margin that, if the scatter had been somewhat worse, might not have existed at all. I find that margin uncomfortable to sit with. Not because it was close. The after-action records suggest it wasn't desperately close, but because it reveals how much of the whole operation's viability depended on partial success in deeply imperfect conditions. The resupply problem on D+1 illustrates, from a different angle, what operational viability looked like for a force fighting without its full complement. 148 resupply C-47s out of 248 dispatched arrived over the division's area on the 7th of June and delivered 155.5 tons of supplies. The drop pattern was poor, per the after-action report on ddayoverlord.com. Many bundles fell into enemy-held territory or landed in positions covered by German fire. For the 101st, fighting to consolidate its causeway positions and pushing toward Carentan to the south, the shortfall in resupply was an operational constraint that shaped what was possible in the days immediately following D-Day. 74% of planned supply arriving with poor distribution is, in aggregate, a worse figure than it sounds, because the bundles that landed in the wrong sector or in enemy hands weren't just lost, they were potentially providing the Germans with captured American ammunition, rations, and medical equipment. The 4 causeways are still there. They still cross ground that was deliberately flooded in 1944. The towns at their western ends, Poopville among them, are quiet Norman villages with memorials and road signs that name streets after American units. Standing at the causeway entrance, looking west toward the beach, you can see the geometry of the problem immediately. The road is narrow. The ground on either side drops into low marsh. There's nowhere to go but forward. The men who cleared those exits in the early hours of June 6th were solving the problem that the entire operation had been designed to solve, in conditions that the design hadn't fully accounted for, with a fraction of the force the design had allocated to the task. They solved it. The beach opened. And the ledger, the one that records what it cost, comes next. Chapter 16. The Ledger. Through the 30th of June, 1944, 25 days after the drop, the 82nd Airborne Division had sustained 4,480 casualties, 457 killed, 1,440 wounded, 2,583 missing. The 101st Airborne Division's toll was 4,670, 546 killed, 2,217 wounded, 1,907 missing. Those figures come from the Citizen's Voice reporting in June 2024, drawing on Gordon Harrison's Cross-Channel Attack, the official Army historical volume published in 1951. Together, 9,150 men from 2 divisions in 25 days. That's the ledger. The ledger should be read against Lee Mallory's prediction of up to 70% casualties, which we covered earlier. Over the full campaign, the 2 divisions sustained roughly 35% combined losses relative to their jumping strength of approximately 13,400. Considerably below 70%, but considerably above the 8% figure attributed to Eisenhower's post-war recollection. The 25-day figures include men who died in glider crashes, men who drowned in flooded fields, men who were killed in hedgerow engagements that no briefing document had named as objectives, and men who were shot while moving alone toward assembly points they'd never find. The categories of the after-action system, killed, wounded, missing, contain all of those deaths and disappearances in the same 3 columns, treated identically for administrative purposes. The missing figure is the one I keep returning to. For the 82nd, 2,583 missing through the end of June. For the 101st, 1,907. Combined, 4,490 missing men from 2 airborne divisions, nearly half the total casualty figure. Missing encompasses several distinct realities. Some of those men were dead and unrecovered, in flooded fields where graves registration units hadn't yet reached, in hedgerow engagements too dispersed to produce a burial record. Some were prisoners. Some were temporarily cut off and eventually rejoined Allied lines days or weeks later, coming in from the west after moving through German-held territory in small groups. And some, in the scattered, improvised battle the Airborne actually fought, simply never came back without anyone knowing exactly when or where they were lost. The 91st Division's own casualty figures during this period are not my central focus here, but they're part of the ledger's context. The Army University Press staff ride materials reference German forces in the Murderay area as being significantly degraded over the same 25-day period. The German casualties in the broader Normandy campaign, per the CWGC historical records, ran to approximately 290,000 by the campaign's end. For the specific engagement around the Carentan airborne zones, the documents don't produce a clean divisional-level German casualty figure that I can cite with confidence. What they do record is that the 91st Division was progressively unable to maintain its defensive positions, that the combination of the airborne landings, the Utah Beach link-up, and the subsequent push towards Cherbourg degraded it as a fighting formation over the course of June. Fally's death was part of that degradation. The Lafayette fighting was part of it. The sum of scattered small actions, each undocumented at the divisional level, was most of it. The battle at Lafayette Bridge on the Murderay lasted 4 days. The National World War II Museum's documentary account of the engagement describes it as probably the bloodiest small unit struggle in the experience of American arms, with more than 250 American lives lost. 4 days. One bridge, over one flooded river on the western edge of the airborne perimeter. The crossing was approximately 500 meters of raised causeway with open water on both sides, a geometry that offered no cover, no flanking option, no route around. On the 9th of June, D+3, glider infantry made a daylight assault across that causeway. The Warfare History Network account describes the attacking force moving in column across a road with no cover on either side, under fire from prepared German positions on the western bank. They took it. The cost is in those 250 lives. The 82nd Airborne's battalion commander figures tell a complementary story. The National World War II Museum's article on the airborne invasion records that in the 82nd alone, 15 of the 16 battalion commanders in the parachute infantry regiments were killed or wounded in the first 25 days. 15 out of 16. That's the level at which units are directed in close combat, not division commanders in chateaus, but lieutenant colonels who know the names of their company commanders and can read the ground in front of them. Losing 15 of 16 at that level isn't just a casualty figure. It's a measurement of how completely the battle consumed the leadership structure of the division. The units that held the Murderay line and took the Lafayette causeway and linked up with the 4th Infantry Division did so, for large parts of those 25 days, under officers who'd been battlefield promoted to fill positions that were supposed to be held by men with months of unit-specific experience. The D-Day figures, the single-day count, are 2,499 for both divisions combined, drawn from Harrison's cross-channel attack, as cited in the answer box data from the warchronicle.com compilation. 1,259 for the 82nd, 1,240 for the 101st. On the 6th of June alone. That's roughly 19% of the total jumping force in one day. Those figures were below Lee Mallory's worst-case projection. They were above Eisenhower's post-war recollection. They were what they were. The cost of the scatter, the glider crashes, the flooded fields, the hedgerow ambushes, and the specific tactical situations that the plan had expected to unfold differently. There's no version of that number that simplifies cleanly into either the plan worked or the plan failed. Both things were simultaneously true in different sectors, at different hours, for different reasons. The after-action system that produced those figures was built for payroll and replacement requisitions, not for historical accounting. A soldier classified as missing on the 6th of June might remain missing in the records, even after being confirmed dead the following week, if the paperwork didn't catch up. A soldier counted as wounded might have died of his wounds after the report cut-off date. The administrative machine moved at its own pace, and the pace of the battle moved at another pace entirely. What the ledger captures is a snapshot, not a complete picture. The 2,583 missing men in the 82nd column through June 30th includes the men in the flooded fields who didn't release their harnesses in time, the men in hedgerow engagements whose bodies weren't recovered until weeks later, and the men who walked out of German-held territory in July and reported to the nearest American unit. All three categories, the same column. 9,150 casualties from 2 divisions in 25 days. Alongside that, 1 beach secured, 4 causeways opened, a German divisional commander killed before he could direct a counterattack, 1 town, the first town in France, liberated before the sun came up. The relationship between those two sides of the ledger is not a clean equation. You can't weigh 9,150 against 1 beach and produce a moral or strategic verdict. What you can do is hold them together and ask whether the planning that created the conditions for both, the plan that sent 13,000 men into darkness without the navigation technology to guarantee their accuracy, was honest about what it was asking. Whether the men who made those decisions, including Eisenhower on the night of June 5th, fully modelled what they were committing those 13,000 men to. I don't think they did. I think they made the best decision available to them under real constraints, and I think the ledger is the record of what that best decision cost. Chapter 17. What the report said and what they didn't. The after-action report filed by the 82nd Airborne Division for Operation Neptune concludes, in its summary section, that the division accomplished its mission. That sentence appears in a document that, a few pages earlier, has recorded 30% effective strength under command by nightfall of D-Day, aerial resupply at 74% of planned delivery with a poor drop pattern, 2 of 3 divisional communications radios lost, and 2 regiments each at approximately 25% effective strength, 17 hours after the drop. The conclusion and the evidence are both in the same document. No one in the chain of command who signed off on that report appears to have felt obliged to reconcile them. That silence, that gap between what the narrative section recorded and what the summary concluded, is the starting point for this final chapter. After-action reports are institutional documents. They're written by staffs, reviewed by commanders, filed in archives where they become the substrate of official history. They're not lies, as a rule. They're selections. The selection principle, what to include, what to emphasize, what to frame as lesson learned versus what to frame as acceptable operational variance, reflects the institutional interests of the organization that produced them. The 82nd Airborne had fought well. Its men had accomplished things that the planning documents had said would require a fully concentrated, well-supplied force operating at 100% strength, and they'd accomplished those things at 25 and 30%. That was genuine. The report captured it. What the report was less interested in capturing was the extent to which the accomplishments came despite the conditions, rather than because of the plan, and what that distinction should mean for future planning. The lesson learned sections in the post-Normandy assessments, compiled by both Army Ground Forces and the Army Air Forces, identify several specific technical failures: insufficient Pathfinder training time, inadequate coordination between troop carrier pilots and the airborne units they were carrying, a routing decision that added navigational complexity by approaching the Carentan from the west rather than directly across the channel, and close formation flying in cloud and darkness that pilots hadn't sufficiently practiced. These are real findings. The post-war USAF Historical Study number 97, Airborne Operations in World War II, European Theatre, completed in September 1956, documents them systematically. And the lessons were applied. Subsequent large-scale airborne operations, including the September 1944 market garden drops, used daylight timing and longer Pathfinder lead times, incorporating the specific technical corrections the Normandy analysis had identified. What those lesson learned sections did not recommend, in any of the documents available in the primary record, was a fundamental reconsideration of whether large-scale night airborne drops against defended terrain with limited navigational technology were operationally viable at the level of precision the plans assumed. That's not a small omission. Every major airborne operation of the Second World War, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, Holland, the Rhine crossing, had produced significant scatter, casualty rates above planning estimates, and tactical outcomes that diverged substantially from the operational design. The pattern was consistent. The institutional response was to improve the specific technical variables, pathfinders, timing, routing, while leaving the basic concept intact. I understand why. The concept had, in aggregate, produced results that were operationally useful. Utah Beach opened. The Murderay was held. These were real outcomes. But the consistency of the scatter across every operation in which the conditions were anything less than ideal suggests that the technical fixes were treating symptoms of a deeper problem in the operational concept itself. Market Garden, 3 months after Normandy, produced a familiar pattern. The drops were better concentrated. Daylight helped enormously. But the operations still encountered the gap between planned coordination and actual execution that had characterized every large-scale airborne operation. The British forces at Arnhem landed more accurately than the Americans had at Normandy, found their objectives, and were then unable to hold them against a German armoured force that no one had accurately assessed before the operation. The planning failure at Arnhem was different in character from the planning failure at Normandy. Navigational accuracy wasn't the main problem, but both operations reveal the same institutional pattern. An operational concept that worked in the ideal case, embedded in a planning culture that consistently underestimated the gap between the ideal case and the actual one. There's a specific piece of the Normandy ledger that the after-action reports handle particularly badly, and it's the missing figure. 2,583 missing from the 82nd, 1,907 from the 101st, through the 30th of June. The after-action system treated missing as an administrative category, a placeholder for men who couldn't yet be accounted for as killed or wounded. In many cases, those men were eventually accounted for, returned from behind German lines, confirmed as prisoners of war, or confirmed as killed when their remains were located by graves registration units. But the administrative category of missing didn't distinguish between a man who was temporarily cut off and a man who had drowned in a flooded field on the night of the drop. Both were missing until further evidence determined their fate. The consequence for historical accounting is that the official figures considerably understate the D-Day death toll for the airborne, because a substantial proportion of the missing were dead and simply hadn't been confirmed yet when the report was filed. The graves registration system that was supposed to locate, identify, and record the dead was operating under exactly the kind of conditions that break administrative systems: wide geographic dispersal, contested terrain, ongoing combat, and a population of bodies in locations, flooded fields, remote hedgerows, tree landings, that weren't being systematically searched in the first days after the drop. The qmmuseum.army.mil account of graves registration at Normandy describes the use of identification tags and graves registration form number 1 for temporary burials, with the process of confirming identities extending weeks and months past the fighting. For men who drowned alone in the Murderay lowlands in the early hours of June 6th, that process might extend to never, a permanent missing, an unresolved administrative category in a ledger that was supposed to close. The 30% figure, the 82nd Airborne at 30% effective strength under command by nightfall of D-Day, is the statistical summary of everything this account has been working through.
It's the C-47 payload arithmetic and the scatter, the Pathfinder beacons and their limits, the flooded fields, the lost anti-tank guns, the battalion commanders killed in hedgerow engagements, the resupply bundles in enemy-held ground. Every specific operational failure and every piece of technical underperformance is contained in that number. 7 out of 10 men unaccounted for when the first night ended. And the after-action report that contains that figure concludes, mission accomplished. Both things are true. That's the honest summary of the D-Day airborne assault. The mission was accomplished by men operating at a fraction of planned strength, in conditions the plan hadn't modelled accurately, at a cost the planning documents hadn't honestly projected. The achievement was real. So was the cost. The institutional preference, then and in most of the histories that followed, was to lead with the achievement. This account has tried to hold both.